Welcome to Miss Retro Reads. We're continuing with Robinson Crusoe. If you will remember, he was taken as a slave, and then his ship went down, and now he's on an island trying to survive. I now set about building a dwelling on a little plain on the side of a rising hill. There was a hollow place in the rock, like the entrance to a cave. But there was not really any cave or way into the rock at all. On the flat of the green, just below this hollow place, I resolved to pitch my tent. Before I set it up, however, I drew a full circle before the hollow place, and in this half circle I pitched 2 rows of strong stakes, driving them into the ground like they stood very firm, and the biggest end being out of the ground about 5.5 feet, and sharpened on the top. Then I took the pieces of cable which I had cut in the ship and laid them in rows, one upon another, between those 2 rows of stakes up on the top. This made a fence so strong that neither man nor beast could get into it or over it. The entrance into this place was not by a door, but by a short ladder to go over the top. The ladder could be lifted in after me, so that I was completely fenced in and fortified from all the world. Into this fence or fortress I carried all my riches, my provisions, ammunition, and store. I made my tent double. That is, one smaller tent inside a bigger one, and even covered the uppermost part of it with a large tarpaulin, which I had saved along with the sails. I knew the rains during some part of the year would be more or less violent, and I thought it best to be prepared in advance. As time went on, I dug a cave in the hillside back of the tent. I used the iron crows brought from the ship for a pickaxe, and made a thing like a hod with which to carry away the dirt that I dug out of the cave. I had made a shovel out of a piece of exceedingly hard wood which I had cut from a tree. Week after week I worked on the cave, hollowing out a spacious room, which was to serve me as a warehouse, kitchen, dining room, and cellar. No matter how hard I worked each day, I always managed to find time to go out with my gun to see if I could find something fit for food. It was a great satisfaction to me to learn that there were wild goats on the island. I often killed one and carried it home with me. I did not wish to lose my reckoning of time, nor did I wish to forget the Sabbath day. So I made a great cross out of 2 posts and set it up on the shore. Upon the sides of this square post I cut a notch with my knife every day, and every 7th day I put a notch as long again as the rest. Every 1st day of the month was as long again as that long one. In this manner I kept my calendar. It was now the rainy season, but nevertheless I made rounds in the woods for game and always discovered something to my advantage in these trips. One day I found a kind of wild pigeon, and its young ones made excellent meat. In the managing of my household affairs, I found myself wanting, of course, in many things. I was at a great loss for candles, and was obliged to go to bed as soon as it was dark, about 7 o'clock. I remedied this to a certain extent, for whenever I killed a goat, I saved the tallow. This I placed in a little dish made of baked clay, and added a wick of some oakum. It made me a fairly good lamp. In the midday of my labors, it happened that, rummaging my things, I found a little bag that had evidently been filled at one time with corn for the feeding of the poultry. But seeing nothing in the bag but husks and dust, I shook it out on the side of my fortification under the rock and proceeded to use the bag for other purposes. What was my surprise about a month later to see a few stalks of something green shooting out of the ground. After a little longer time, I saw about 10 or 12 ears of perfectly green barley. I carefully saved every grain and laid it away ready to sow again hoping in time to have enough to supply me with bread. It was now the month of April, and I had about finished my wall and ladder, when suddenly the earth came tumbling down from the roof of my cave, and from the edge of the hill over my head, 2 of the posts I had set up in the cave cracked in a frightful manner. I ran forward to my ladder and climbed over the wall. I had no sooner stepped down upon the firm ground than I plainly saw it was a terrible earthquake, for the ground I stood on shook 3 times. A great piece of the top of the rock, about half a mile from me, fell down with such a noise that I was terrified. What if the hill should fall upon my tent and bury all my household goods at once, I thought. To make my situation worse, the rain began to come down in torrents, and there was a great hurricane of wind. The sea was lashed to foam, and trees were torn up by the roots. The wind abated in about 3 hours, but the rain continued all night and all the next day. I climbed over the wall and went into my cave to escape the rain, but I was still in great fear that the rocks would fall upon me. My one desire now was to find a new place for my home where an earthquake could not harm me, but my hatchets and axes were dull and full of notches from cutting and chopping knotty hard wood. Of course I had a grindstone, but I could not turn it and grind my tools too. I finally contrived a wheel with a string to turn with my foot, so that I might have both my hands at liberty. This took me over a week, but it was worth the effort. For a few days more I had my tools in good shape again. My thought was wholly diverted from moving my habitation when one morning I looked out to sea and saw that the earthquake and the hurricane had cast the wreck of the old ship so close to the shore that I could walk quite close to it at low water. I worked every day the next month, bringing pieces of timber, planks, and a great deal of iron to shore. I had enough to build a good boat had I but known how. One day, going down to the seaside, I found a large tortoise or turtle. I cooked it, and the flesh was delicious. It was a pleasant change, as I had had nothing but goat meat and an occasional fowl since landing in this horrible place. I must have overworked in my effort to get everything off the old ship, for one morning I woke up with chills and fever. I was frightened almost to death at the thought of being sick with no one around to help me. I lay abed all day and neither ate nor drank. I was ready to perish with thirst, but I was so weak I had no strength to stand up or to get myself any water to drink. In the night I slept, but had a dreadful dream. I thought I saw a man descend from a great black cloud in a bright flame of fire. His countenance was most dreadful. When he stepped upon the ground, I thought the earth trembled, just as it had happened with the earthquake. And then I heard a voice say, "Seeing all these things have not brought thee to repentance, now thou shalt die." At which words I thought the figure lifted up the spear that was in his hand to kill me. I can never describe the horrors of my soul at that terrible vision, nor the impression that remained upon my mind when I awakened and found it was only a dream. During all my 8 years of seafaring wickedness, I had never thought seriously of God, nor had I been thankful to him for his great mercies. But now I began to pray for the first time in many years, after which I fell into a refreshing sleep. When I woke again, I felt much better, and arose and cooked 3 turtle eggs in the ashes and ate them. I remembered that the people in Brazil took tobacco for the ague. I had some in one of the chests I had saved, and I went to get it. I was directed by heaven, no doubt, for I found in the chest a cure both for soul and body. Packed in with the tobacco was a Bible, which I had forgotten all about, but which I was now overjoyed to find. I read from it a long while, and having taken a dose of tobacco steeped in rum, I went to bed. The next day I had the fever again, but not so bad. In a few days it left me, but I was so weak that I could do but little. I sat in the mouth of the cave and tried to weave baskets. As soon as I was able to begin to apply myself to making such necessary things as I found I most wanted, particularly a chair and a table, for without these I was not able to enjoy the few comforts I had in the world. I would not write or eat or do several other things comfortably without a table. I then made shelves about 1.5 feet wide all along one side of the cave, and on these I arranged all my tools, nails, and ironwork. I also drove pieces into the wall of the rock, on which to hang guns and all things that would hang up. My daily reading of the Bible gave me a great deal of comfort, the first I had had since coming to the island 10 months before. I began to give up the idea of ever being rescued and decided to be as happy as I could. It was about the 15th of July that I began to take a more particular survey of the island itself. I took some provisions with me and I started out. After walking about 2 miles, I came to a creek whose banks were covered with grass, and on the higher parts I found tobacco growing. There were many other plants that I had never seen before. On the next day I went farther the same way, and my joy I found melons and grapes. I stayed there all that night, sleeping in a tree as when I first landed. In the morning I traveled on, some 4 miles farther. Here I found a beautiful valley, where everything appeared so fresh and green that it looked like a planted garden. There were oranges and lemons, limes, and cocoa trees, but few of them bore fruit. I gathered some green limes and found their juice very refreshing. I resolved to lay up a store of them for the wet season. I picked a large quantity of grapes and hung them upon the other branches of the trees so that they might cure and dry in the sun. As for the limes and lemons, I carried a great many back home with me. I was so enamored with this beautiful valley that I began to consider moving my habitation there. After giving the matter some serious thought, I came to the conclusion, however, that I had better stay by the seaside, where something might happen to my advantage. The same ill fate that had brought me to the island might bring some other unhappy wretches to the same place. To hide myself among the hills and woods in the center of the island might mean giving up all hope and chance of rescue. So I contented myself with building a little bower over in the fruitful valley, where I stayed 3 or 4 days at a time, calling it my country home. The 3rd of August I found the grapes. I had hung up more perfectly dried, and were now excellent raisins. I had about 200 large bunches of them. No sooner had I taken them down and carried most of them to my cave than it began to rain so violently that I could not stir out of my cave for several days at a time. I was very careful now about getting wet, as I was afraid of another attack of fever and ague. In this confinement I began to be straitened for food. Fortunately, the rain ceased for a few hours, and I went out and killed a goat and found a very large tortoise. My meals consisted of raisins for breakfast, goat's flesh or turtle for dinner, and turtle eggs for supper. I always had to broil my meat, as I had no vessel in which to boil or stew anything, and this was a misfortune. I counted up my notches on my post and found I had been on shore 365 days, for it was now the 30th day of September, the unhappy anniversary of my landing. I kept this day as a solemn fast and determined to keep my 7th day from now on as the Sabbath day. After a time, I learned how to divide the rainy season from the dry. The lack of this knowledge at first had cost me dear, for I had sowed my grain before the dry season, but none had come up. Fortunately, I had not sown at all, and planted the few grains left before the next rainy season, and it grew very well, though it was several years before I had enough to make a crop. I now took care to have plenty of provisions on hand for the next season, and stayed within doors as much as possible during those months. I occupied myself by weaving baskets, which proved a great service later on when I wished to carry things from the fruitful valley to my cave. As soon as the rains were over, I started on a trip clear across the island, taking a hatchet, gun, and large quantities of powder than usual, and followed by my faithful dog, I started on my journey. As soon as I came to the opposite seashore, I was surprised to see the sand covered with turtles. On my side of the island, they were very rare. I don't believe I had caught more than 3 during an entire year. There were also a great number of fowls of many kinds. Some of them were very good meat. This side of the country was much pleasanter than mine, but I no longer had any inclination to move. I was getting accustomed to my habitation. All the time I was on this side of the island, it seemed as if I were upon a journey and from home. It was a very clear day, and I could see land in the distance. Whether it was an island or a continent I could not tell. Neither did I know what part of the world this might be, except that I figured it must be part of America, down near the Spanish dominions. On this journey, my dog surprised a kid goat, which I caught and led by a string. I always saw an abundance of parrots, one of which I knocked down with a stick and brought back with me to tame. I was more than delighted when I came to what I called my home and threw myself in my hammock. I had been gone a month. Everything seemed so comfortable here, and I resolved never to leave it for so long a time again while I remained on the island. I now read the Word of God every day and began to derive great comfort. I no longer rebelled at fate for casting me on this uninhabited island, even though I still was a prisoner, locked up with the eternal bars and bolts of the ocean. One morning I opened my Bible at these words, "I will never leave thee nor forsake thee." From this moment I began to conclude in my mind that it was possible for me to be happy in this solitary condition. If God does not forsake me, said I, what matters if all the world should forsake me? Thus I began my 3rd year. I was seldom idle, dividing my time according to my daily employments. First I read the Scriptures. Next I spent 3 hours hunting for food, and the rest of the day was passed in curing, preserving, and cooking what I had killed or caught for my supply. While working about, I talked much to my parrot. I had taught her to call me Robinson Crusoe, and it pleased me greatly to hear her repeat it, as well as a few other things she had learned about after much drilling on my part. I came near losing my crop of barley and rice, which at best was not large, for some goats and wild creatures, which I called hares, started to eat it up one night. So I had to fence in my field. This took me over 3 weeks. In the meantime, I tied my dog in the gate, where he would stand and bark all night long. No sooner had I driven these enemies away than the birds began to eat up the ripe grain. I finally shot 3 of them and hung them up as scarecrows. This had the desired effect, and the latter end of December I harvested my corn. I was sadly in need of a scythe or sickle. However, I was fortunate in having brought on shore from the ship one of the broad swords or cutlasses. With the aid of this would-be reaper, I cut the ears of corn and carried them away in the great basket. After rubbing the seeds out with my hands, I found that out of the half peck of seeds that I had planted, I had nearly 2 bushels of rice and 2.5 bushels of barley, that is to say, by my guess, for I had no measure at that time. The household utensils that I was most in need of was an earthen vessel that would hold liquid and stand the heat of the fire at the same time. I spent much time in hunting for right kind of clay. After experimenting about 2 months, I finally managed to burn 2 earthen jars without cracking them. This success led me to make all kinds of earthenware. I must confess that the shapes were decidedly ugly, as I had no way of making them save as children make mud pies. I next started to make a mortar. As the rocks on the island were all too soft and crumbling to use, I took a great block of hard wood, and with much labor I rounded the outside. With the help of a fire, I made a hollow place in it, as the Indians in Brazil make their canoes. Then I made a heavy pestle or iron wood, with some muslin taken from the ship. I lifted up some very good sheaves, and in a short time my corn was ground or pounded into the floor. The next thing to be considered was the baking. I made some hollow earthen vessels, which served as hearths. In these I built hot fires, and then raking the ashes and embers off clean, I put in my loaves and covered them with earthen jars. As I worked away on these things, you may be sure my thoughts ran many times upon the land which I had seen from the other side of the island. I could not help feeling that if I were on the opposite shore, I might find some way or other to convey myself farther, and perhaps at last find some means of escape. If only I had a boat, thought I could venture out to sea in search of the mainland. I had been so successful in everything I had made that I now considered myself skillful enough even to make a boat. I didn't stop to figure out how I would launch it after it was built. I just started right out to make it. For 20 days I hacked and hewed away at a great cedar tree that was 5 feet 10 inches in diameter at the lower part, and 4 feet 11 inches in diameter at the end of 22 feet. It took me 14 more days getting the branches and limbs and its vast spreading head cut off. I then worked about 4 months trying to shape the bottom and hollow out the inside. If anyone ever worked hard with mallet and chisel, I'm sure it was I. At last I was rewarded for all my labors, for there stood a handsome boat, big enough to carry about 26 men. I was more than delighted, and now began to think about getting it into the water. But all my devices failed me. The boat lay about 100 yards from the water, but the trouble was, it was uphill towards the creek. But I dug into the earth and made a declivity. When this was done, I was no better off than before. I could not move the boat. Then I began to cut a dock. And we're going to continue this book next Friday or Saturday. Will he get the boat into the water? You'll have to come back to see. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.